Hello and welcome to Mentorship Masterminds, the PMI podcast where we deep dive into the world of leadership, innovation, and professional growth. I'm your host Mahesh Deshpande, and I'm excited to bring another episode of Mentorship Masterminds. This podcast is sponsored by Project Management Institute San Francisco Bay Area chapter, and we are recording it at the vibrant Golden Gate University campus in the heart of downtown San Francisco, a city synonymous with pushing boundaries and breaking molds. And that's precisely the spirit that fuels our podcast. Friends, in each episode, we talk to industry leaders or mentors who have carved a niche for themselves in the annals of leadership and innovation. We discuss topics that we believe are instrumental in shaping our next generation leaders. Today, we are going to talk about authentic storytelling in context of personal branding. A few years ago, I was in Times Square, New York, where I was attending a brand management Wintrim, where I had the opportunity and privilege of meeting the brand manager of Mini Cooper. During the course of conversation, one thing that he said has stuck with me. Brand management for products is about making brands more human, and personal branding is about making humans more authentic. In today's social media generation, where our personal and professional brand is shaped by social media, it's imperative to understand how authenticity is a key to personal branding. Today we are going to talk about that topic, and I am thrilled and honored to have a very special guest with us in today's podcast. We have with us Vanessa Merina, who is the Vice President at KQED with their branding and audience engagement. Vanessa is a storyteller at heart and a brand builder by profession. KQED is a popular public media company with public radio broadcasting and public television with award-winning shows. Vanessa is leading the marketing and branding department at KQED. Vanessa, welcome to Mentorship Masterminds.
Thank you. So excited to be here.
You have a diverse experience, a rich history of working in public media, healthcare, and you have wore various hats in each of these companies. Can you kick off this podcast by talking about your experience in public media, your story across the years?
Absolutely. So I have had an opportunity to spend a lot of time in different areas, different industries. But the thread that sort of runs through it all is that I have had an opportunity to pursue jobs that I have a personal connection to. So I actually started to study abroad. And it was because at 19, I got a scholarship to live outside the country, and it really opened my world. I became an admissions counselor at an organization for 2 years in San Francisco to help bring international scholarship students to the States to live with American families and to study at high schools. And then I moved into public policy because, again, I had been the beneficiary of a tremendous system in the community college system in LA where I grew up. I had the chance through that college system to study abroad, to have my own radio program, to work with the group that allowed students to transfer to four-year universities and have that opportunity that they otherwise wouldn't have had. And so I pursued that interest in public policy and worked for a think tank in the Bay Area for 6 years. It was my job to oversee the publications. So I actually worked alongside researchers, took their research and put it into a form that really resonated with both policymakers and the general public. So it was a tremendous education in how to take very complex ideas and concepts and make them accessible and actionable for lay audiences. I then moved into healthcare, where I was for 8 years, and the way I made my way into healthcare was at the time I was looking for my next opportunity. My mom was undergoing treatment for ovarian cancer, and she unfortunately had to undergo blood transfusions. And I saw her before and after blood transfusions, and it was night and day. Afterwards, she was able to carry on conversations and take walks through the community that really kept her connected to the outside world, which was critical. And so I wanted to be sure that patients in need got the blood they needed. So I moved into a blood center, headed up their marketing and communications team, and one of our primary responsibilities was to tell the story of blood donation. At the tail end of my 8 years there, the pandemic hit. And I started seeing a lot of my colleagues having a really tough time in terms of what they were seeing in the industry at large, that a lot of people didn't have access to the healthcare they needed or access to really critical information. And so I had an opportunity through speaking to our head of the company to build our first DEI program to convene the types of conversations to support our staff. And then finally, I took my interest in providing fact-based journalism and information forward into public media, where I am now. And so again, it has been a little bit of a path for me, but there's this thread that runs through it where I pursue opportunities where I have a personal interest in seeing them through.
All my guests, I ask this question and I hear how personal stories motivate them across their career to take different paths and bring a diverse and rich experience. And
absolutely.
I think that makes them successful and brings them to this podcast.
Yes, yes.
So, Vanessa, you are leading the audience engagement and brand development. You have championed brand development at KQED. Could you talk to us about the power of branding for companies? And since you have worked across diverse industries, how does companies across diverse industries pursue branding?
Right. So first of all, branding is incredibly powerful. I think of it in some ways as the sum total of how we show up to others, right? And to your point, companies have brands and individuals have brands, teams have brands, and certainly products have brands. And so the question becomes, do we want to be intentional with how we show up for others? Or are we comfortable letting it, leaving it to chance, if you will? And I would say it is incredibly important, in particular in this increasingly competitive age, to take control of how we're showing up to others. And I would say, as an example, I think bringing it back to public media, where I am now, we are at a particularly interesting and pivotal point. Because in some ways, we have to build the next generation of public media listeners, public media audiences, public media supporters. And we can no longer depend on the habits that we once relied on. So when I was a kid, my parents took me and put me in front of the TV, and I watched Sesame Street and I watched Mr. Rogers, and I had that emotional connection from the get-go to public broadcasting system, PBS. And I knew when I grew up, my kids would do the same and I would support. Yeah. We no longer have that. And we also no longer have post-pandemic. We're not through the pandemic, but we are post sort of some of the tougher days. We no longer have the types of commutes we used to have. So we are no longer getting into our cars and listening to NPR and are familiar with, the same hosts and the same shows, right? So in many ways, we can't rely in public media on what we used to rely on. I would even go so far as to say, we can't rely on anyone under 20 or even 25 knowing what public media means, and knowing that over 60% of public media funding comes from the community, from members. Yeah. So I would say if we can sort of put that aside and really go to the heart of the storytelling and ask, what is the value that we bring into people's lives, and almost recast that for younger generations, then we can tell the story of public media being what we're bringing to people. And essentially that is, fact-based, trustworthy journalism to improve their lives. And if we can do that and work with the communities that are most impacted to tell that story in their voices, I think we can be successful.
That's powerful. I would like to piggyback on your last statement about storytelling, right? So what does storytelling mean to you when it comes to personal branding? People like to be associated with brands across companies like Apple, KQED, for example, or Tesla. But when it comes to personal branding, there is somewhat a negative connotation to it, and even for storytelling. So what does storytelling mean to you? And can you also talk about the role of authenticity when it comes to storytelling?
Absolutely. So I tend to think of storytelling and brand as intermingled. And brand to me is, again, sort of everything that comes together for how we show up for others. And if we're really committed to being intentional about that and taking the time to build it out, then it gives us a tremendous advantage over, let's say, the other candidates going for that job, or others on the team raising their hands for that amazing project, right? It sets us apart because we are digging deep into what makes us us, and we set ourselves apart in a really, again, authentic way. The reason why I think that's so important is because we are bombarded in our daily lives with so much inauthenticity, right? And people can spot inauthenticity a mile away. They know when they're not dealing with a brand or a product that is really showing up in a real way. And if we can put the time in and build our brand in a way that really resonates and folks can relate to, then I think not only are we skirting the possibility of not showing up authentically, but we are sort of in our full power, that we are showing up in a way that can help get us to our goals.
Your answer reminds me of KQED's famous California report, right? And award-winning storytelling shows. In fact, yesterday I was listening to how freeways are shaping California, right? And amazing storytelling, insightful, got me hooked. You have been working in this area for some time, and coming to storytelling, do you have any framework on how to tell an authentic story? Do you have any examples or framework that you would like to share?
I'm happy to share something that has worked with some clients when I was coaching, working with folks who are at sort of pivotal points in their career transitions and wanting to create and find their authentic stories and voices in the professional setting. So happy to kind of walk through what has worked in those conversations. I tend to really start with what is the larger vision that you're working towards. In other words, what is the world that you are hoping to get to? So an easy way to get to this is to ask, I want a world, or to begin with the phrase, I want a world that, or I want a world where, and I'll use myself as an example. So I want a world where every individual and every organization is doing their best work and realizing their best selves. So that is my vision, that is my North Star. The next thing you want to ask yourself, if that is your vision, then what are you uniquely doing to get there? And in my case, I can share that after many jobs and much conversation, I realized that I make ideas happen. That's something that I have honed and built over time. That's actually an observation that one of my coaches in the past made about me. Some of us over-index in the area of strategy and vision. Some of us over-index in tactic and execution. I have found a way to do both effectively. So the next thing you want to ask yourself, if you have your North Star, and then you have the sort of unique contribution that you are making to get to that North Star, you ask yourself, all right, then how do I show up in doing this work, right? How do I show up personally in making ideas happen? And this really gets to core values. And the reason why I think it's critical to start with core values is that it's incredibly hard to ask yourself to be two different people, one personally and one professionally, because essentially we're the same person, right? And so if you start with core values, then you can start with a sort of a foundation and a scaffolding and then build from there. So I'll ground with a specific example. For myself, my core values include three things: curiosity, integrity, and community. So curiosity is essentially really trying to get to understanding first. It's understanding that I am a work in progress at all times. Integrity is about living my values and ensuring that I model for the teams I lead what I ask of them. And then community is really about connecting with a larger organization or group, right? It's not just about me. So I now have my core values. So I have vision, I have what I'm doing to get there, and I have how I'm showing up. Next thing you want to ask yourself is, what does it look like, say, to be curious? And I would say for me, being curious looks like entering into any conversation, seeking to understand first. So that might be listening. That might be asking questions instead of jumping to conclusions. And it also really critically for me personally means I take 1 to 2 to 3 courses a year to try to understand that I'm always growing, right? So once I have that framework, the final question I want to ask, getting back to your question about how to integrate storytelling, is looking back in my own life, where are the 1 to 2 moments when I have really lived that brand? And you will find that there are moments that you have really been at your best, and those are the stories that you can begin to build. So if you're interested in building your brand and your storytelling, that is a helpful framework to start with.
You have just laid out a blueprint for us on how to go about it. I'm so grateful. This is so powerful, Vanessa. Thank you for sharing. I'm sure our audience members will leverage this as a platform to develop their storytelling. Having said that, there are still people who are hesitant to go about. They know the importance of storytelling and this whole platform, the structure that you have laid out. I think it makes sense, but there's still some hesitation among which I've seen among people when it comes to storytelling, that they don't want to get into it, right? Can you talk a bit more about how to overcome this barrier and navigate on their journey of personal storytelling?
Sure. I'll start with just admitting storytelling is a bit of a buzzword. And I have seen a lot of individuals and organizations really wanting to go there and wanting to implement storytelling, but having a hard time with it. And I'll share just a few sort of barriers to entry, if you will, in some ways to work with those. So the first, I think, is when you have something that is, a fairly sort of popular term, you will often have a lack of understanding about the fundamental definition of it. And I have found, especially with companies, that if they can't define it and kind of wrap their arms around it, they're not going to implement it, right? So I would start with definition. At its essence, storytelling is relating your message to your core audience in an effective, largely visual, compelling, and relatable way. And who doesn't want to do that? So just grounding it in definition to begin with sometimes is a first step towards implementation. The second goes back to, I think, a point you just made, which is there is some vulnerability involved in storytelling, right? And what I would say to that is, going back to the point about trust, if we're really wanting our audiences to trust us, if we're wanting folks to trust the products that we're creating, right, the projects that we're putting into the world, then we want to build trust. And in order to build trust, we need to step in and be a little vulnerable ourselves, right? Nobody's going to be vulnerable with us and trust us if we're not willing to meet them halfway. And so if we can be vulnerable, a wonderful way to do that is through telling story and getting a little personal. And so in some ways, while there is a little bit of a risk in being vulnerable and entering into story, there is almost more risk in not doing that and not connecting on that level. The third and final example I'll give is around just beginning, right? Often companies will say, I want to do storytelling, but I don't even know where to begin. Do I have to bring in an outside consultant and really put a lot of resourcing into it? And the answer is no. You can actually start with a low-hanging fruit. So in every organization, there are examples of this. If you have an annual report, for example, or if you're doing a post-mort or a wrap-up in a particular project, infuse it with a little anecdote, right? Talk about the user or the customer or the audience member who was personally impacted with the change that you brought about. Don't just show up with the data or with bullet points, right? We are not, oriented towards that. Make sure that you're showing up with a little bit of story. If you have a sales team, they can infuse it with a little storytelling. And what will happen over time is there will be success stories, and folks in the organization will ask, hey, so what is getting them to success? It's a little bit of storytelling. They'll start to incorporate it, and it'll become your culture. So just some kind of typical barriers to entry and ways to address those.
Your example reminded me of those congressional hearings where they not just tell facts, but they also get someone who's a victim to make it more human and
yes,
to give an example, not
very
just
powerful to personify. Yeah, absolutely.
You spoke about vulnerability and building trust. Do you have any example that you want to share about how to go about making those more authentic while being vulnerable, while trying to build a story, but at the same time ensure that the authenticity of the piece is not missing? Do you have any examples that you want to highlight?
I'm happy to share. I think authenticity, when we talk about that, is really getting to two specific things. It is certainly grounding in what's real, right? What is truly your story and not anybody else's in a way that only you can tell. And I think beyond keeping it real in a fundamental way, I think about keeping it small. And I don't mean, when I say keeping it small, showing up small. I'm a big believer in showing up as big and as large as you need to, right? In a real and authentic way. What I mean by that is, I think when we start to talk about storytelling, we often are tempted to think that we have to tell enormous stories with enormous themes, right? If I want to tell a story about disappointment and redemption. I think, oh, I have to pull huge stories from my past. And when I don't have those in my past, I think I might have to adopt somebody else's story, or I might have to embellish. And that goes directly against authenticity, which is still important. So what if I wanted to tell a story about redemption after disappointment? I could tell the story of just a few weeks ago, I'm getting up from my desk at home at the end of a long work from home day, and I am dreading the next few minutes because I have to get up and walk across the kitchen into the living room where my daughter is and disappoint her. And the reason I know for a fact I'm going to disappoint her is because I have to tell her that we're going to cancel her 7th birthday. And she has been looking forward to this 7th birthday for months. In fact, she planned it herself, and down to the cupcake toppers, the ice skating party, and her 4 best friends, right? In fact, she asked my husband and me to blow up every balloon in the house and just have it be a visible reminder of her impending birthday. And unfortunately, a couple days before, she had tested positive for COVID. And it was a very mild case, but it was a positive test nonetheless. So I'm getting up, dreading this, and I stand up, I walk through the kitchen, and I walk into the living room, and there she is back to me on the couch. And the first thing I see is a bunch of the balloons have been amassed around her, and I'm thinking, this is really gonna be rough. So I walk into the kitchen, and I face her, and I start to talk, and I say, hey, and I say her name. I have something to tell you. And before I can even get the words out, she says, Mom, I know what you're gonna say. We have to cancel my party, and I wanna show you something. And I'm like, okay, what is it? And she shows me that she has taken the balloons and put them in a kind of a haphazard line. And she shows me that she's written on each balloon with a Sharpie a message to herself. And she proceeds to read them to me. So she starts with the balloons on the left-hand side and kind of goes from there. The first one is really sad, and it says, I am sad, it is my birthday, I'm crying, okay? But then it moves to, it's my birthday, happy birthday. And then it moves to, happy birthday to me. And the last balloon says, I am the hero. And I'm like, what does this mean? We haven't talked to her about heroes. Maybe it's coming from her 1st grade teacher. And she looks me in the eye and she's like, you know what? I'm good. And she goes downstairs and she plays. And I'm like taking pictures of the balloons, and I'm messaging my husband. And as a parent, I'm thinking in that moment, right, that maybe I'm a little less needed than I thought I was about 10 to 15 minutes ago, and that hurts a little bit. But I'm also realizing at the same time that she, this 6-year-old, almost 7-year-old, has in her everything that she needs to navigate the disappointment. And everything that we did to get to that point, right, wasn't working. She needed to hear it in her own words, aimed at herself. And, I share that because that was a small moment, right? That was a small, quiet moment with 2 people, and it happened exactly like that. And so I think we don't have to reach outside ourselves and our own experiences to share what may resonate.
You have a brave girl.
Yes, right? I couldn't believe it myself. I'm pretty amazing.
That's an amazing story. I think that speaks a lot about authenticity and power of authenticity in storytelling. You work a lot with young professionals, and you have worked across countries. Like I know you've also worked for some time in France, and you have worked in diverse areas. Right? What's your message to spread optimism among young people? With regards to storytelling, how can young people really tell stories that are powerful, authentic, based on your learnings and experience over the years?
I love that question because I have always believed that young people play a tremendously important part in solving really big problems. And I believe that, I think, since I started working, even early in my own career, I knew that I had something to contribute. And maybe it wasn't experience or deep expertise, but it was energy and it was fresh thinking. And so I really believe that no matter where you are in your career, whether it's beginning part of your career, mid-career, later on in your career, this holds true. I'll give you a quick example of where at KQED we're really implementing this. And that is, our journalists have created this incredible tool, this incredible voter guide. And what it is a guide that enables you to really show up when you're ready to vote, feeling completely prepared and educated and informed. And the challenge is that this is completely free to all, but not a lot of people know about it. And so in our audience teams, our job is to get it into the hands of folks who may be voting for the first time, for example. And so for the first time, we're actually creating what I consider a bit of a dream team and working with the university students to think about ways that we can spread the word on this amazing voter guide that our journalists have produced. And we're pairing these university students with people who have deep expertise and experience. And I think what will come out of that is just an opportunity to let more people know that this is available to them, and therefore to sort of spread the word that this exists and it can really help them in their lives. So I do think, to make it actionable for anyone who may be moving through their career at different points, if you're at the beginning part of your career, raise your hand for opportunities where you might take on some of the tougher challenges and the questions at your company that may really benefit from fresh thinking, and raise your hand for projects and teams that could, again, create a bit of a dream team pairing youth and idealism and hope, and also pairing experience. If you're mid-career, really important, because you're at this awesome nexus of still having this innovative thinking and also beginning to have positional power and build those teams, right? And be a decision maker. And if you're more senior, that is awesome as well, because you could actually institutionalize this thinking and create regular ways for people to come together across generations and really build things together and solve problems.
I'm so glad I'm having this conversation today. This is really bringing me a lot of memories, and it's really impactful and powerful for me. So thank you for sharing these experiences. Vanessa, I want to switch gear and talk about technology, right? With all the recent hype and hope of that generative AI brings to the table, right? Many industries, many roles are going to get impacted, are already getting impacted. When it comes to storytelling, it's more easy than ever now to take narratives. You must have experienced over the course of years how technology has impacted storytelling, right? So what's your take on the technological evolution in narrating authentic stories, and especially how generative AI is going to shape this?
That's a big question. All right, I'm going to try to tackle it. So I will start by saying, first of all, acknowledging, right, that technology is moving very quickly. Platforms are transforming, and some are going away, some are really proliferating. The first thing to do is, I think, kind of reframe and not feel quite so daunted, but see it as an opportunity. I think it really pays to think first about generative AI is something that we should all be familiar with and do a little bit of thinking about, in particular around our own areas of expertise, right? How is it impacting our industry? How might it be impacting the projects we're working on and the questions that we're trying to answer? So that will signal to whoever you're speaking with and interacting with that you are curious to find out, right? And you're staying ahead of technology. So do your homework there and be able to speak articulately to it. I think that it puts you at a bit of an advantage there. I do also want to say that you don't have to feel overly daunted and try to show up on all platforms. I like to think of it as start with the goal that you're trying to achieve, right? If you are trying to say, get a new job in a new industry, something that I'm very familiar with, right? So you're trying to get a new job in a new industry, then you can think about, all right, what audience is most likely to support me and champion me and, help me get to that goal. So if it is, for example, getting a new job in a new industry, I might say the audience that will be most likely to support me and help get me there is, as a mid-career woman leader myself, maybe other mid-career women leaders might help get me there, right? We have a lot in common. We might even have more experiences and life experiences in common than others in my industry. So I will begin to sort of narrow down who I'm trying to connect with. So I now have, right, my goal, and I have an audience. Then I want to learn as much as possible about that audience, including what platforms are they showing up on, what big questions are they asking, and what thought leaders are impacting that space. Then once I know where they're showing up, let's say it is, women leadership conferences, and it is LinkedIn, and it is podcasts. We'll choose one and focus in on that and identify 1 to 2 to 3 thought leaders and engage with their content. So as past podcast, guests have pointed out, very rightly so, engaging with content isn't just a like, it's really truly commenting on the tips and tools that they have provided that have made a difference in your life. Engage with them, comment, let them know how useful they have been in your life. If you feel comfortable, you can respectfully direct message them, let them know that, again, with no ask, they have made a difference. And then if you see them at a conference, perhaps one of the other places that they're showing up, if they're keynoting or presenting, don't be afraid to approach them, let them know how useful they've been, right? So again, technology is moving at a rapid clip, embrace it, do your homework and certainly in the AI space so you can speak knowledgeably to it, and then think about who's going to support you, what platforms are they showing up on, and focus there.
So don't get bogged down by technology.
Don't get bogged down. It's too easy.
It.
Yeah, and it's too easy to get bogged down and also not do anything, right? Just feel completely stymied, and that's not helping you.
We are coming to the end of the podcast, Vanessa. I have a couple of questions. I want to go back to storytelling. Do you have any example in your personal career how storytelling has shaped your experiences over the years? Any that has a profound effect on where you are today, right? That has helped you propel your career to where you are today. Any story that you would like to share which would inspire our audience to go and craft authentic storytellings and don't get bogged down?
Well, I will share how storytelling, I think, first came into my experience and life.
Sure.
I will go actually way back to 1992 when I was still a kid. And my father was a journalist in LA where I grew up. And he was covering the LA riots. So for those unfamiliar with the LA riots, this is the aftermath of the Rodney King verdicts, where a lot of communities were really confused and angry and hurting, and they were moving into the streets to express that frustration. And my dad, along with a handful of other journalists, were dispatched to cover this. And I remember being on our front porch, because it was warm days, and seeing my dad come home periodically in between covering the communities. And he was coming home to sleep for a few hours at a time, and he brought with him a bulletproof vest and a gas mask. And I asked him, why are you going back out and going back out? And he was very clear with me. He said, it is my job to go out and tell the stories of these communities in their own words. And that really struck me. I remember thinking, this is important work. And so I think I carried that forward throughout my career. While I didn't become a journalist myself, I did end up getting an MFA, a Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing, so I could really dig into the elements of storytelling and teach that. And I also have come full circle to a certain extent, right, in public media, to support journalists and bring journalism to our communities. And so I think for me, beginning there and having that be the genesis of my own experience with storytelling, understanding how incredibly important it is that communities tell their own stories, and then playing some small part in it has been incredibly gratifying.
As Steve Jobs says, right, like you don't know while you're pursuing, but when you look back retrospectively, the dots connect. And I think your dad would be proud of you where you are today.
Oh, thank you for that. Yes, retrospectively, that's where all of the clarity comes, right? Yes.
Absolutely. A lot of our audience members are career transitioners who are pivoting into new career and want to embrace this power of storytelling. You laid out a framework for us. You told us how valuable authentic storytelling is. Do you have any examples of any books or podcasts that they can refer, anything that has helped you that you would like to share with our audience?
I'll point to one book in particular, and that is this book called Storyworthy, and it's by Matthew Dix. So he is both an elementary school teacher, and he is also a multi-time Grand Slam storytelling champion on the Moth Radio Hour. And he writes this book, and it combines these skill sets of teaching and tremendous storytelling. It is the best book on storytelling and the craft of storytelling I have seen come up in the last few years. And I would highly recommend it because it's absolutely actionable. And I think it can really support folks in both building their own stories and finding their own stories and building their own brand.
What is the book again?
It's called Story Worthy, one word, by Matthew Dix.
Vanessa, a lot of our audience members are international students who come from diverse cultures. You have worked in Europe, you have worked in US and across different cultures. How do you think storytelling ties with cross-cultural differences? How do you ensure that the cross-cultural differences embed into storytelling? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I'll share an experience that I had a few years back when I had an opportunity to live in France when my partner was finishing up his postdoc at the University of Bordeaux. And I became a student again, and I took a French class to improve my language abilities. And at the end of our first semester, our final exam was to present a problem that we had observed. And we were up in front of a big lecture hall, and all of the other students were around us. And many of my fellow students presented on really big problems. One of them spoke to the public transit system and how it wasn't necessarily keeping up with the influx of tourists. And another spoke to, because we were in wine growing region, the challenges around multi-generations of winemaking families coming up against corporate interests. I took a little bit of a different approach, and I actually shared a very personal story of a problem I was experiencing. And that was that while I recognized my tremendous privilege to just be a student again, I also didn't have a work visa and I couldn't get one. And so for the first time in 12 or 15 years, I could not work. And it was difficult for me because a big part of my identity was suddenly cut off from me. And the more I spoke to others, particularly women, the more they shared similar stories. And so I presented on this, and at the end of the presentations, I was standing with my other fellow students, and a woman approached me, and she introduced herself. Her name was Margot, and she said that she had come from Poland to the region a few years back. And while she was able to work, she experienced a lot of the same challenges. And she mentioned that a lot of the other programs and problems that the other students spoke to were these big problems that she couldn't necessarily get her head around, but this one spoke to her. And she asked, do you want to create a solution together? And so we ended up co-founding a nonprofit that gave folks the opportunity to teach courses in their professional areas of expertise. And they were compensated not in euros, but in other courses. So this gave them the opportunity to deepen their own skill set, right? Because we learn by teaching. It also gave them the opportunity to broaden their communities and their networks in a new culture and place. And really importantly, when they returned to their respective home countries, they could bridge their resumes. So I think a lot now about if I hadn't shown up and shared what is essentially a personal story, I might not have connected in that way and might not have had the opportunity to build a solution to the problem.
Wow. So your authentic story about yourself, you being vulnerable and putting it out there helped you open new avenues.
I think that's one of the ways that it connected.
On the same lines, how do you see storytelling tying up with DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion? Can you share experiences at KQED or other areas where you have worked? How does storytelling tie into narrating authentic stories of that power DEI?
So I did have the opportunity to build our company's first DEI program when I was in healthcare. And it really started with storytelling in many ways. It was the first months of the pandemic, and our staff were really struggling with what they were seeing in the larger sort of healthcare setting and experiencing. And we didn't have a mechanism, we didn't have a program to convene the types of safe spaces that allowed them to share. And so that's where we started. We really started with building safety so that we could get to trust. And that took us, I would say, 4 or 5 months to convene these conversations, to convene a place for folks to show up and share their stories. And at first it was a handful of people. And then word got out that this was a safe space, and then it grew from there. And it took us about 5 to 6 months to get to a point where we could actually create the program itself. So I would say, particularly in the DEI space, that you have to, if you're hoping to get to storytelling, convene safe spaces first and foremost and ensure that you're taking the time to do that. The other thing that I would add, just for general awareness that happens sometimes, is when people gift us with their personal stories, at times we can assume that they are the spokespeople for their communities. And that is not being fair to individuals, right? If I tell the story of being multicultural, as I have told before, that is a gift and it ends there to a certain extent, and we can't expect people to speak on behalf of larger communities. And that's something that can sometimes come up. So I add that just for awareness that convening the safe spaces is the first step.
You can't pass that burden on those people.
Absolutely. And that's a lot to take on. It's not something that folks particularly feel comfortable with, and it's something to keep in mind.
Thanks for sharing. Vanessa, a final piece of any piece of advice that you would like to share with our audience members and which would motivate them to go and craft their stories, developing their personal brand?
Don't be worried about just beginning, right? We've given you a framework. We know that you have an interest in it. And honestly, if you just jump in with intention, you are worlds beyond so many other folks who are trying for that job or trying for that project. And also, again, don't worry that you have to tell big stories. It is in those small and quiet spaces that you can connect most.
Vanessa, it was a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining on Mentorship Masterminds.
I really appreciate it. Had so much fun.
Thank you for tuning into today's episode of Mentorship Masterminds. Today's episode with Vanessa Merina on authentic storytelling. I hope it inspired you to create and craft authentic stories to help build your personal brand. For similar stories related to leadership, innovation, and growth, keep listening in to Mentorship Masterminds with me, your podcast host, Mahesh Deshpande. Until next time, keep thriving, keep inspiring.